Welcome everybody once again to this panel today, Fungal Lessons and Ecological Storytelling. I'll spend a few minutes introducing our guests in just a moment, but I was invited to also suggest that, or to say that Mount Tam Integration Jam is all about celebrating good psychedelic practice. I understand. I think I did that right. So it's a delight for me to be here. I am Ian McKenzie. I am the host of the Mythic Masculine podcast, as well as a co-founder of the School of Mythopoetics. I will be helping facilitate this conversation best I can, but these three will make my job easy, I have no doubt. First up is Mario Alonso Oneiros. He has an MA in philosophy of religion with a complementary formation in transpersonal psychology, author of Oneiros, I said that, co-founder of the Proyecto Nido, a tent of psychedelic care and festivals, academic coordinator of MindSurf, the most important community in Spanish-speaking countries that provides education on psychonautics and expanded states of consciousness. Welcome for being here. Sophoe Strand is a poet, historical fiction writer, essayist, and author of Flowering Wand, to be released later this year, and The Madonna Secret, which maybe is next year. And yeah, back to back. I can't wait. Welcome, Sophoe. And Simon Yugler, with a master's in MA, is in-depth counseling psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Simon is a depth psychotherapist and psychedelic integration coach for people seeking greater meaning, purpose, and guidance in their life. Welcome, Simon.
Hi there.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, in the lead up to this talk, we the four of us just had a bit of, jam on how we want to roll into this, and thought just to offer up the initial launch, which was crafted by Sophoe actually for this talk, which you've all read likely so far, which is what drew you to this talk. But it's short and sweet, and I thought I'd just offer it up here and then maybe turn it over to Sophoe to say, what do you mean by that? Here it is. How can we use fungi as a working metaphor to think through what it means to live in an age of ecological collapse and mass extinction? How can we trace the relational ontologies that constitute psilocybin to understand that a psychedelic experience doesn't just belong to us? It belongs to a whole chain of relations that bring it into being. Sophoe, if you'd be so kind, if you share a little of what stirred you there and in your crafting of that, and what you'd like to speak to now as we get into this conversation.
First of all, I did not realize that was going to be the description for the entire talk, but I'm glad it is. I think the place I want to start is I've been a little troubled lately by the monolithic idea of fungi. And the truth is that there are over 370 million different types of fungi, and we've only identified a very slender amount of them. And to pretend like all of those stories are the same is a kind of homogenizing injustice. And that today we're talking about a very narrow narrative, a very particular narrative. And it's important to root things into their actual context and to be context sensitive. And what I've been interested in about psilocybin is, in this culture, we're very simplistic in the way that we interact with food, with each other, with other cultures. We don't really see that they've come to us through a long chain of relationship. And, I think veganism is actually a really good example. Not that veganism is wrong at all, but the idea that you can have an object and it is pure or impure, and you can decide that meat is bad and an avocado is pure, ignores the fact that the avocado is full of a complex, tangled web of injustices as well. So I think it's always important to start weaving the things that we have relationships with back into their web of relationships, because if we're partaking of them, we're also partaking of all of these other rootlets. And for me, something I've been troubling as a person who has been greatly helped by psilocybin, has been taught by it, has worked with it, is that psilocybin is deeply wedded with shit, with cow shit. And it grows on cow shit, not exclusively, but it's very tied to it. And it's been interesting to me as a mythologist, as someone who has studied the history of myth, particularly in the Mediterranean basin, that we see a long history predating patriarchy of sacred cows and sacred horns and sacred bulls. And then there's a moment where that shifts and we switch into dominator cultures, and the cows are suddenly bracketed into horticulture and into agriculture and start to be devalued. And those sacred nature-based cultures are denigrated alongside cows. And something I've also been thinking is interesting is cows were used by the colonizers to terraform America and to destroy indigenous environments and ways of life. And that cows are, in a certain way, some of the most disrespected beings in America right now. They are some of the most violently degraded beings. And that global warming is in fact fueled in a certain way by this complicated relationship. And so I've been thinking lately that we have such a deracinated, simplistic idea of what it means to take psilocybin. What if psilocybin wasn't about my particular mental health, about making me a better producer and consumer inside capitalism, but about tying me into cow shit? You know, there are only so many times you can take psilocybin and have it just be a juicy, clean experience for your own ego. What does it mean to realize that what you're taking ties you into a web of relationships that goes into Eurocentric terraforming, to incredibly violent agricultural practices, to the destruction of indigenous land and lives? So what does it mean to tie yourself into cow shit every time you take psilocybin? What kind of responsibility is that? So yeah, that's my little rant. That's something I've been thinking about. Like, what if taking psilocybin was about becoming really entangled and involved with cows?
Thank you, Sophie. I feel either if you're started to jump in.
Yeah, I want to thank you for just sort of starting us off on that foot, Sophie, because I often like to say to people that I work with and people that I talk with that, you know, at the end of the day, psychedelics are not actually ultimately about increasing your mental health or making you feel a little better so you can go back to you know, working at Google or whatever. In fact, you know, it's interesting to me, this is kind of a tangent, but you know, psychedelics are kind of slowly making their way into the workplace, right, into the corporate world. And I think the true test of the metal there is going to be how many people actually quit their jobs through these sort of corporate psychedelic renewal experiences, because ultimately I think that's sort of the trajectory that a lot of these experiences want people to, or I should say, kind of put people on, is the road to descent. And something you said about the sacred cow and the role of shit in regards to mushrooms, I can't. The two things that came to mind that I want to kind of invoke here, mythopoetically speaking, is I like to think a lot about psychedelics as sort of aligned with, if not physical manifestations of the archetype of the trickster and various trickster gods and beings. And I think a lot about the birth of Hermes and this sort of juxtaposition that he has with Apollo in the story of his birth. And there's a moment where Apollo kind of picks him up to sort of shake him and says, you know, like, did you steal my sacred cows? Another cow reference. Did you steal my cows and sacrifice them for your own edification? And Hermes is like, I don't know what you're talking about, and proceeds to shit all over him. And then everyone kind of sees it and is like, oh, wow. Well, I guess that's funny. So, I mean, I can't help but thinking of that, like, really potent, interesting moment in the birth of Hermes. But the second thing that I want to invoke about cows that I've thought a lot about and have been writing a lot about is this idea in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when he, if people are familiar, Gilgamesh is the kind of conquering hero of Sumerian mythology, essentially kind of our first, the first like hero who goes out and conquers, right? And he he slays the bull of heaven. And it's an interesting kind of intersection in Sumerian mythology, because the goddess Inanna would never go down into the underworld if it wasn't for the death of the bull of heaven. So there's this whole ancient, mysterious connection between bulls, heroes, underworld, and goddesses that I think is just such fertile ground.
Definitely. I would like to jump in a little bit with this last part that you mentioned, Simon, this underworld reference, because basically shit is this disposal of things that were alive and that now are being processed and going back into the unseen, invisible world, that basically mushrooms help to disintegrate and to process, and then to get back nutrients to the earth. And then you can see the mushroom as an individual entity coming out of earth, but then beneath that individual entity, there is this complex web of connections, a network, the mycelium that basically interweaves other plants, other entities. So it's not like this notion that we have in Western culture, like the individual and how you can use psychedelics to enhance your own performance or heal yourself. It's more like you come back to this underworld perspective in which ego is death, and then you become connected to all of these other entities. And that is something that is very honored in the Masochics culture, because for them, mushrooms are a sort of intermediate entity that allows them to be in touch with other animic or spiritual entities. So it's as a sort of communication god, or someone that allows you to think beyond your own individual perspective. And actually healing for in the Masochics perspective has to do a lot with dealing with your shit, like the things that you've done to other people, the things that you have done wrong, like not just to other people, but also to nature. And so after the mushroom ceremonies, you have to take responsibility of the things you've done, of your shit. And then there's the principle of reciprocity. Like you have to give back, you have to reconnect, you have to link yourself again to this web of otherness that surrounds every individual. So that's something that kind of connects all of these symbols and mythologies to ways of understanding consciousness in individuals and communities.
Thank you for that, Oneiros. It strikes me again, this sense that like without beings that have this corresponding mythological counterpart or like way of relating, that it's inevitable, it seems, that they get drawn up into, if we're talking about the West, like an individualistic paradigm, which doesn't have a corresponding story or mythology in order to understand, how to work with, or what is the being, what is its way, and how to best collaborate, let's say, with the being. And so I'd love to hear if there's any more too around, Simon mentioned more of the West, or at least the deep Western mythologies, Greek, and other places too, and under Sophoe. Like, what are some ways in which mythology is like the necessary, I don't want to say counterpart in a way, but like it's the way that we actually understand how to be with these beings, or how to be allies with them, instead of sort of turn them into tools again for individualistic, performance and endeavor.
Yeah, this is kind of my jam. Can I hop in?
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Oneiros. I mean, yeah, I always say that, you know, a hero is not an individual. A hero is like a mushroom. It's a reproductive event. That heroes are just these moments where the land wants to reproduce a certain kind of knowledge from deep under in a mythic mycelium. And I think if you look at the Mediterranean basin in Europe, what you actually see instead of these individual gods or heroes is you see a vegetal mycorrhizal system that mushrooms up in different places differently, but shares a rhizomatic continuity. Like we can see that Dionysus has the same attributes as someone like Jesus. They're involved with dying and resurrecting, with fermentation, invasive species. The same goes for Orpheus, for Attis, Adonis, and Osiris. And I think that in a moment when in the West, we're very fixated on the individual, it's important to realize that perhaps we are these reproductive flourishes of the land. And that I think, you know, mushrooms come up from the land and we pluck them and we eat them. And in that way, we become a mouthpiece for the land, for these deeper stories, these stories that are working on a much longer scale than a human lifetime. I mean, one of my favorite things about fungi is that plants that we know today didn't have root systems when they made it onto dry land. It was, you know, root systems are a fungal life form and pattern of behavior. And for millions of years, fungi acted as surrogate root systems and taught plants how to have roots. So I think for me that fungi are this very real way of showing us that our wisdom, our healing, our medicine stitches us into relation, stitches us into these bigger stories and makes us a mouthpiece for them.
I see some nodding heads. Yeah. Anyone else want to pick up on that thread?
Yeah, what comes to mind hearing what you just said, Sophie, is something that someone who I work with, I also work down in Jamaica at a mushroom therapy retreat center called Myco Meditations as a therapist and retreat leader. And someone I work with down there who is a very talented facilitator in his own right, you know, oftentimes where we get a lot of people who've never taken psychedelics, who aren't, you know, remotely into psychology, let alone ecology. So we're doing a lot of sort of worldview poking and probing with a lot of these people gently. The mushrooms do it for us mostly, but sometimes people have a hard time kind of getting it or connecting with the experience or sort of connecting with the mushrooms themselves. Oftentimes I've seen people on 15, 16 grams still thinking it's not working for them, which is always really interesting. And one of my colleagues down there has this thing that he talks to people about, which is, he says, you have to be willing to let yourself be borrowed. And I just absolutely love that because I see Sophie's like, yes, totally. You know, I think of like the ant and the cordyceps mushroom growing out of its head, but the worldview that we are in, the world that we operate in, the expected response to a statement like that is, what is borrowing what? Like, what do you mean? What could possibly be borrowing what? When in reality, you know, what you're speaking to, Sophie, is that there is such a unseen interconnective process that occurs when we engage in, you know, consuming an appendage of the natural world, whether if it's a psilocybin mushroom or peyote or even a synthetic molecule, which many of the great chemists like Sasha Shulgin and other people kind of believed to be little sort of creatures, even though they were, you know, chemists and firmly rooted in that world. They would refer to their creations as, you know, this little being has this to say, right? So there's an inherent understanding of the personification that is imbued in these medicines.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, Oneiros.
Yeah, regarding this personification of the entities that Like, I mean, this is something really important for traditional indigenous perspectives, since they do not see the mushrooms are as just a tool or something that you use for your own healing or whatever. It is someone, it is a person, it has agency, it has consciousness, and therefore it requires a relationship with them. And within this particular mythopoetic vision of it, they are usually called the little ones that sprout, or the saint kids. And so they are thought of as a sort of kind of playful entities that they show you the world as if you were back into the infancy of God. Basically, it's like coming back to the Garden of Eden, seeing the world as a kid, as a cosmic kid. And so this kind of re-enchants the world. This provides with personality, or to plants and to mushrooms and to it's like human being after the use of these sacred biotechnologies. They can go back into this enchanted world where everything is seen as magical. And so this is something that I think it's also important to recover, to get to gain again this this mythical perspective in which nature is no longer mute, in which it talks to us, in which it has agency, and it has, I mean, those plants are personified, and then it requires a different relationship towards nature, since you're no longer just alone as a human being, but you're in this bigger community. And I love this idea that Sophoe said, like, it entangles you with the bigger story, with a story that goes much longer and than the regular human life. It is a story that comes from prehistory, and it will continue even after human extinction. So getting in touch with this mythical perspective, with this magical re-enchantment of the world, is one of the things that mushrooms, and I would say mostly any psychedelics, teaches about.
Mm. Thank you, Oneiros. I understand too, the origin of the word enchanted is to be sung, something like, yeah, to be sung by the world, maybe is one way in which you're using it, or to hear the song of the world. Again, yeah, I hear that in what you're sharing. I'd love to bind it now to the conversation of what was asked too from Sophoe in the description. Is so we have this relationship, we have this kind of reawakening to the mythic and to communication with the world. And so what might it mean to live in an age of ecological collapse and mass extinction? What might the fungi be trying to tell us about the trajectory of perhaps the modern West, and what might be need to hear from them, and are we hearing from them? And anyone, yeah, feel free to jump in if you feel stirred.
I first want to say thank you, Simon, for the "Let Yourself Be Borrowed." I'm going to be quoting you for a long time. And Oneiros, thank you for the cosmic kids and that long story view. Yeah, kids, trickster energy, definitely like somewhere in between there. And I think something that was coming up as I was listening to both of you and Ian asked this question is, it seems to be a relatively ubiquitous experience that when people really open and let themselves be borrowed, it's not just the fungi that are talking through them, it's the everything. It's, the trees, it's the insects, it's the weather patterns. And for me, this is a moment where the human narrative has held center stage for so long. So perhaps the being that you notice, those voices come up as your sensory gating opens, and your default mode network relaxes, and you get to actually take in you stop gating out the world. Maybe it's that being that shows up to you that needs you to help it, and that the mushrooms are this intermediary between you, creating a relationship between you and another being. Like perhaps it's a deer, perhaps it's a plant. I know for me that I've been very, very fixated on woodchucks since I started taking psilocybin. And I couldn't have predicted that relationship, but it seems to be very close, that when I take psilocybin, I'm very keyed to woodchucks. So I'm trying to pay attention to that. And how can I protect their habitats? How can I wed myself to their concerns?
Beautiful. Yeah, anyone else feel bound to any furry rodents in their experience, or other beings that have taught them important things about the nature of this time?
I can't claim any allegiance to anyone in the rodent kingdom, but I remember when I was in the Amazon, I think one of my maestro's brother-in-laws was carving pipes, and I really wanted some like jaguar pipe or like something badass. I was like, yeah, dude, like I'd like a pipe. And he carved it for me. And it was, it took a process, and being out there in the jungle, I would go out to visit this particular tree every day. And the most important encounters I had were with these big blue butterflies that live in the Amazon rainforest. And it became very clear over time that it wasn't going to be a jaguar, but a butterfly. And so I went back to the maestro's brother and said, okay, turns out it's not a jaguar, it's going to be a butterfly. So, and in that there was this, it was kind of an important moment of listening to the medicine and listening to the interconnective experience, the phenomenology that was unfolding through relating with this medicine, because it's saying, no, this is what's coming to you, like accept this and be humble enough to actually receive the butterfly and all the medicine contained within that, and not be fixated on some sort of, cool thing. But what I was going to say that I want to kind of connect to this idea of psychedelics in the time of ecological collapse is this notion that we kind of circled around earlier, but this notion of the underworld, and this idea that has been so prevalent in our culture and has really done us well for a long, long time, which is kind of this heroic up and out movement, escape, flying away, right? Ascending. Every time I hear the word ascending in sort of psychedelic circles, it's like red flag to me, because I think the move isn't to escape and ascend and go to Mars and just abandon this beautiful planet, but it's actually to go down and in. And, in the mythopoetic tradition, it's sort of taught that spirit moves up and out and soul moves down and in. And I think what we're being asked right now in this global time of death and this time of burning and flooding and collapse is to go down and in, back into the roots, back into our souls. And I think that's why these medicines are having their day in the sun right now, because the earth needs us to kind of go down and in, come back.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the biggest messages of psychedelics and well, specifically mushrooms within the Mazatec community, I believe they have something very important to show us, and is that there is a map for this like there's a geography of the spirit, And since modernity, humankind has fixed their attention towards the upper dimension, the sky, the ascendance, going up, and progress, and the exterior. But then and this is something that is actually very common amongst most of ancient indigenous tradition. For them, apart from the human reality and the celestial world, there's the underworld. And these three different planes of existence interconnect. And in the Mazatec culture is very clear. They have within the veladas, which are the sacred mushroom ceremonies, they do this in front of the altar, the shrine, in which there are three different levels, one of them corresponding to the underworld, and then there's the human world, and then the upper celestial world. And the velada, the ceremony, goes as a sort of trajectory of the sun that comes from the east and then goes up, reaches into the sky, and then comes down and goes back and hides itself into the underworld. And so each of these dimensions of existence have their own inhabitants. The underworld is filled with the ancestors, the things that we need to remember that are no longer here, but they're still here with us if we open the gate for them. And then there's the upper world, the invisible, luminous, eternal entities such as God and the saints, and well, every council has their own poetic imagination of the inhabitants. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I think the biggest message is to expand our conception of the universe beyond the visible and higher perspective. We also need to integrate the lower, the underworld, and have a complete circle of comprehension. Like, we're not just in this linear process of being born and going to die and then disappearing into this mute nature, but we're more interwoven into a cyclical process that goes up and down and up and down again. And I think that's one of the biggest message of these sacred plants.
Thank you, Oneiros. I'd be curious to hear what is stirred from what was shared, and any of you have maybe some thread you want to chase down. And also, I want to invite those tuning in, if they have any questions too that are stirring for them, to just offer it up in the chat, and we'll see if we can weave it in. But yeah, what has been shared so far that you feel, any of you, that has, you'd like to continue down a thread or introduce a new thread here in the conversation?
I just want to thank Oneiros for that, to create a more comprehensive cosmos. And I was thinking about how fungi related to bulls, to cows, and how the cows were often associated with their horns with the crescent moon and with lunar time and cyclical time. And lunar gods and or bull gods were very associated not with linear progression, but with death, decay, refruit. That it's not ascent or descent. It's that, as you said, it's that ability to go through all of them and learn the specific inhabitants of each level and weave together those different experiences. So I love that the cows work with that they're a symbol of lunar time with their crescent horns.
There's a ancient city in Turkey that is believed to be the oldest metropolis on Earth, called Çatalhöyük, I believe is how it's pronounced. And it's interesting not only because it's the oldest metropolis in existence, but because there's no evidence of any standing army or fortifications, nor any sort of real social stratification. There's no evidence to show us that there's any sort of elite in this culture, that every household had its own shrine, every household had essentially the same amount of tools and food storage, and that essentially it was a gigantic like anarcho communist collective that Terence McKenna in his book Food of the Gods sort of connects to this ancient matriarchal bull/mushroom culture. And interestingly enough, at Çatalhöyük, one of the main kind of religious idols, gods, was the sacred bull and cow. I mean, there's bull horns all over this place, this massive city, shrines in these beautiful and I just can't help but feel like all of these myths where there's a sacred bull involved, it's pointing back to this shift long, long ago, maybe 10,000 years or more, that kind of ancient European, the roots of Western culture that we went through, of moving from this sort of bull relationship, and therefore mushroom and fungal and mycorrhizal and interwoven, way of relating, to where we are now. So I can't get over this kind of idea. It's incredibly fascinating to me. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Sophie, you're nodding a lot too. I think you understand, or you've heard about this city as well and the significance.
Yeah, this is like basically what I write about. I think me and Simon are on the same wavelength, which is, I mean, I think a great example is the story of Theseus. And Theseus goes to Crete and slays the bull, and the bull in the middle of the labyrinth, and kills him. But if you actually look at the stratigraphic layers of the Greeks come down and kill these earlier Mediterranean cults that were like Çatalhöyük and Göbekli Tepe, which also has a thread of bull gods. And you see that actually the bull monster had a name which was a Styrian, starry one, and that the bull was actually the king. And so what you see is dominator cultures come in and take the bull gods and turn them into monsters. And so I was just thinking about that transposition and how you have this god of cyclical time. Crete is also a lot like Çatalhöyük, which is that most of the images didn't feature humans. It featured natural imagery. When there was a human, it was very often a goddess figure in an epiphonic pose, that it was very much about egalitarian nature-based ritual. And they didn't have weapons. They never featured images like Çatalhöyük of violence. And it's so interesting that, the bull god is always associated with these earlier, as Rianne Eisler calls them, partnership cultures.
I just want to invoke real quick Stephen Jenkinson, who Ian, you and I did were able to listen to speak about Beowulf a couple months ago, who you've studied with extensively. And Steve asked this question: who makes the monster? What sort of ways of relating actually create monsters, and what are monsters? And this really interesting idea of what happens to a god once it stops being a god. What does it turn into?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Thanks for evoking that. As I remember those threads as well, that I think there was this sort of wondering on what happens to gods of place, right, when they are, dismissed, or in this case, kept outside of, the human conviviality. In this case, Grendel, is seen and portrayed often as this, beastly character that comes in and, tears up the hall of the Vikings there. But to understand it from a different perspective, from an older perspective, not so much that it's a heroic tale, but it's a cautionary one, sort of at the cautionary at the lack of hospitality to that which grants you your days. In this case, the humans, their capacity to be human, actually. And so when those relationships aren't tended, what monster is a monster? I think that was, hovering there. And so, yeah, I hear that too with this conversation as well, that, we're invoking this descent to the underworld, that the fungi have this sort of capacity, or this weight, or this ballast in a way to kind of pull you down and down in there. And so there's this invitation to, what do we find, or who do we find? How do we build a relationship with them? And I wonder as well, like, how does one maybe better equip oneself for those journeys down in those places, with this kind of understanding? Because we are in a culture often where, again, they're invoked from an individualistic understanding, right? What can I get? How can I upgrade? Whatever it is. But how might one utilize, what's been spoken here to go into these journeys, to go into this underworld with a different kind of willingness to relate, or a different kind of courting?
I'd like to hop into that because, well, the ethnography that I've been doing with the Mazateks has shown me so much the importance of myth as a symbolical map to these sacred spaces. And so basically in the altar, every element is a reminder of what you can find in there. It's a sort of spiritual geography that the shaman, the healer, knows how to guide you through it. And then if he perceives that you're stuck in one of those places, he then uses one of its tools. It could be that they use an egg to clean you. It could be that they use a certain plant to invoke its power. It could be that they pray to a specific saint or whatever. And so this is something like these different navigation tools, which for us in our waking rational perspective, it could be seen as something like it doesn't really make much sense, like to be cleaned with an egg or whatever. But within this expanded states of consciousness, there is a sort of dissolution between what's going inside and outside, and so everything becomes a symbol, or everything has a symbolic resonance, and therefore everything that you do outside, it can also create or detonate or take you into another place within your journey inside. And so for me, and that's also something that it's very interesting, and that we should take more attention to, is that Western psychedelic therapy has focused so much on just trip sitting, like leaving the individual to have a journey for its own. But then the indigenous traditions, through mythology and through ritual, have better navigation tools, and they can guide you through it, and they can let you this thread of Ariadne to travel within this inner labyrinth that we Westerners do not have. We have broken our relationship to myth and symbols, and so basically mythology is something that we should get back to. It would help us to create new maps for these expanded states of consciousness.
Yes, beautiful. Lots of
You're
thumbs
here.
up. Yeah, Simon or Sophie, do you want to add to that?
I would just, I really want to just kind of bolster what Oneiros just spoke to, which is sort of this interesting moment that we find ourselves in, as far as sort of the larger psychedelic community, if you will, of sort of Western psychotherapy, of which I am a part, right? Sort of almost kind of consuming or opening its jaws, so to speak, to kind of swallow psychedelic work, almost like this serpent, you know, and that I can't help but feel like it's sort of the myth of extraction and capitalism that is sort of compulsively guiding us because we know no other way. So I want to just invoke, you know, how important it is to protect these indigenous traditions and the myths and the stories that they have preserved for thousands of years in the face of death. And that, you know, there's a call to anyone listening to this now or later, you know, to take seriously where a lot of these traditions not kind of quickly, not so quickly feel that Western psychology really knows what it's doing.
You know, I'm reminded, Sophie, yeah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to underline and accentuate and say thank you to both what Oneiros and Simon have been saying that Western psychology, just talking with someone about this, you know, was founded by a man who spent most of his career trying to discredit the hysteria of women who had actually been abused. And so that now it's being used as trauma therapy for women who've been abused seems to be very complicated. And as someone who has trauma, I have to say that the incisive surgical approach of psychology seems to be ill wedded to the oblique, spacious, relational intelligence of psilocybin. And yeah, that if we go back to the original quote that we started this with, when you're taking this, you're taking the traditions, you're taking all of the ritual and mythological inheritance, you're also taking the violence and the oppression and the ability of these rituals to persist despite that. And so you should know that it's that oblique, older way of relating that is perhaps resonant with this substance, rather than this very sterile, fluorescent light surgical approach. Go in, go out. Yeah.
I just want to say real quick, is it any wonder that fairy rings grow in a circle, not a cube or a box, right? Like there's a circular nature to the mushrooms themselves that go back to what Oneiros was talking about, the sunrise, zenith, and descent, you know, and this whole idea of these things bring us into ourselves, bring us into the earth, bring us into the soul. And it makes me think of the words of Antonio Machado, who said that mankind owns 4 things that are no good at sea: rudder, anchor, oars, and the fear of going down.
Thank you, Simon. You know, I just feel to add one little nugget too, that I remember listening to a podcast, it was maybe a year ago, but it was with Jordan Peterson and Tim Ferriss. I don't know if I think they might've done it a few times, but I was just struck by the conversation was dovetailing around, I think it was around psychedelics. And Jordan was saying, you know, these states, you know how just wild and beyond, you know, normal conception, normal consciousness they are. But the way he said it was bizarre. He's like, and nobody knows what to do with it. Nobody knows what to do with it. I was like, what? What do you mean nobody knows what to do with it? Like it was so absent, this recognition. And again, I say this because, you know, Jordan says a lot of interesting things and a lot of outrageous things, but he also was named as, I think, one of the most significant Western thinkers of this era. I think, you know, by Time Magazine or something. So again, it's the West conferring endowment upon a towering thinker of the same kind of thinking. But again, it strikes me just as this archetypal inability to recognize or to look outside his own frame of reference. In this case, you know, from the West frame of reference of what these states mean and why. So it just struck me again as we're hearing this conversation that there's something around also this turning towards a relationship or turning towards a responsibility in a way that I think Simon even touched on, with the sense of, if this is now being incorporated into corporate, offices or retreats and things like that, the same thing that the mindfulness movement sort of had a moment to kind of have that encounter, but it seems, sort of a missed opportunity if all mindfulness did was make you better at being, in your job, in a system itself, which is destroying the planet. So how mindful was that mindfulness, right? And so I think a similar challenge is here before with the psychedelics, right? Is if it doesn't turn you back towards, whoa, wait a second, like, what am I participating in, and how might I actually ask me to be accountable in some way, or to engage in some way outside of my own, upgrading a personal growth mantra. Let's say that, that's the real test. Like, has it mattered if there's been a willingness to turn back to say, wait a second, we got to engage with these times in a meaningful way. Becca's raised hand, and I'm love to wonder how to bring you on, Becca, or to write something in the side, if that's how the webinar works. Oh, she said sorry. Okay, maybe that was an accident too. Anyway, so we have just a few minutes here now to wrap before the end of the hour as well, and maybe I'll turn it back again to all of you, what you'd like to leave the listeners here with in this conversation.
I would like to wrap up just by saying how important it is to go back to our roots, to these mythological perspectives, to the ritual, symbolical approaches to the sacred plants. And well, here in Mexico, I'm participating in this research project towards the healing potentialities of mushrooms containing psilocybin, but within this dialogue of knowledge with the indigenous traditions. Like, we want to have this reciprocity approach. We want to give them a place within the psychedelic science arena, because we think, mostly, basically, these magic mushrooms came to be known to the world thanks to the Macetecs, and most of the corporate pharmaceutics that are thriving in millions and millions, and with this new psychedelic therapies and all this, they are they're getting very rich, while these poor communities in the Mazatec and different other traditions in Mexico, they're being exploded for their own technologies, and so we need to do something to protect these traditions that have stood for so long before us. They are our ancestors as the psychedelic movement, and so talking about relational ontologies, what's more important is that we respect our relationship to our ancestors.
Beautiful. I love that. Yeah, these are the ancestors of the psychedelic movement. Yeah, thanks for that, Oneiros. Yeah, Simon or Sophoe.
I don't have much else to add. I mean, other than this particular intersection that we're kind of exploring, or as Sophoe said, troubling here, is kind of what I am most excited about in the arena of psychedelics, of mental health, of psychotherapy, of myth. It's endlessly fascinating to me, and I think unless we as a community and a culture take seriously these questions of relationality and responsibility and reciprocity and obligation, that, unless we can seriously integrate these very big questions, we run the risk of just doing more of the same. And I think everyone listening to this knows deep in their bones that we cannot afford as a species to continue doing more of the same. So I want to just kind of invoke that call, to everyone to be vigilant for ways of operating in the world and ways of relating with psychedelics, and even ways of speaking about psychedelics that are kind of directing us back towards just more of the same. We're at like kind of a cultural crossroads moment. And one road I like to say is the road of initiation, and one road just goes back to more of the same. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you, Simon. Sophie.
I think Oneiros and Simon said the most important things. I mean, the only thing I have to offer is just a rearticulation of the same, which is, in extractive culture, you're always looking to be fixed, to get something that will fix you. You're always looking for the medicine that will make you feel better. And I do think that if you're participating in medicine, your imperative is to become the medicine next, to not stop, not let that process stagnate in you, but let it move through you. And I think that if you participate in the psilocybin experience, you have to ask how it makes you into a medicine for something else. I think Oneiros gave us a really practical way of doing that, which is protecting actual indigenous populations who have this wisdom and have a real relationship with this being, with these cosmic children. I think that's a really practical way of letting it politicize you almost, and weave you back into community. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, well then let's close it now. Thanks to Sophie, to Simon and Oneiros for this discussion, Fungal Lessons in Ecological Storytelling here at the Mount Tam Integration Jam. I'm the host, Ian McKenzie, and it was a pleasure to weave some threads with all of you. Thank you all for listening in, attendees, and beautiful discussion here on a Sunday. So let's see how we do in the days and weeks and months and years to come.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Stay in touch.